The restaurant was called Ardent. It was the kind of place that used single-word names and charged $32 for a plate of pasta, the kind of place where the lighting was warm enough to make everyone look like they were in the middle of a memory being formed. The walls were exposed limestone, the wine glasses were crystal, hand-blown, so thin that the light passed through them like they were barely there. Outside, a late May rain had started, the slow, deliberate kind that doesn't hurry, that sheets down the windows in long, unhurried lines and makes the streetlights blur into something almost beautiful. It was 9:14 p.m. on the night of my college graduation. I had stepped away from the table to use the restroom, or so I told myself. The truth was that I had needed 30 seconds of air that wasn't filtered through Darlene's perfume and the performance of togetherness that had been running, without intermission, for the last 4 hours. I was standing in the narrow corridor between the main dining room and the private event space just past the glass partition, when I heard my mother's voice, not raised, not sharp, the voice she used when she wanted to be overheard by the right people. "We're just so grateful she has somewhere to call home," Darlene was saying. "It hasn't been easy, financially." I stood completely still. Through the glass I could see the back of her head, that precise architectural blowout she refreshed every Thursday. And across from her, the woman with the reporter's notebook I had been introduced to as a family friend earlier in the evening, the journalist. The one Darlene had mentioned in passing 3 weeks ago when she said there might be a little human interest piece about our family. I hadn't thought much of it. I should have thought everything of it. She came to us with so little, Darlene continued. Her wine glass caught the light. The foster system doesn't prepare children for real life. We've been filling in those gaps for years. I did not cry. I did not step around the partition and correct her. I did not do the thing that every single nerve in my body was suggesting I do, which was to walk to that table, pull up my banking app, and place my phone, screen facing up, balance visible, directly in front of the journalist's notebook. I took out my own phone instead. I pressed record, and I stood there for 4 minutes and 38 seconds, letting Darlene's voice fill the audio file that would, 6 weeks later, become Exhibit C in a formal complaint filed with the State Attorney General's office. Then I went back to the table, sat down and raised my glass when Gary offered a toast. "To Elaine," he said. "Our daughter." I smiled. I drank. I said thank you. I was 26 years old. I held a fiduciary license in 2 states. I managed portfolios valued at over $40 million for clients who trusted me with the architecture of their financial lives, and my annual salary was $118,000 before bonuses. Not one person at that table knew any of it. Before I go any further, drop a comment right now and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I genuinely want to know who's part of this community. Because what I'm about to tell you is not a simple story, and I want you here for all of it. My name is Elaine Mercer. Though that last name is borrowed, adopted, technically, the same way I was, and I have been carrying it with the quiet, careful awareness of someone who knows the difference between a name that is given in love and a name that is assigned for administrative convenience. I was adopted at age 4 by Gary and Darlene Mercer of Columbus, Ohio. I have no memory of my biological mother, though I have, in the last 3 years, assembled a fairly complete picture of her from DNA registries, county records, and one photograph that a social worker left in my file like an afterthought. She died when I was 6, 2 years after the adoption was finalized. Before she died, her own mother, my biological maternal grandmother, a woman named Ruth, who I have no memory of meeting, placed the entirety of her estate into an irrevocable trust. Ruth had been a school teacher for 31 years, had owned a small rental property in Cincinnati, and had invested modestly and wisely for decades. She named me sole trustee and sole beneficiary. The trust was valued, at the time of Ruth's death, at $634,000. By the time I graduated college, thanks to the brokerage account my predecessor trustee had managed conservatively and then handed to me the day I turned 25, the total assets stood at just over $900,000. Darlene and Gary Mercer did not know this trust existed. No one in my adoptive family did. The documents had been delivered to me by a probate attorney when I turned 18, quietly, legally, correctly. I had said nothing about it. Not because I was ashamed, not because I was afraid. Because I had learned, by the time I was 8 years old, that financial information in the Mercer household had the half-life of a secret and the spending velocity of a rumor. I had learned to hold things close, the family I grew up in was not cruel in the ways that show. There was no shouting, no visible chaos. The house was clean, the Christmas cards were professional. Gary coached Little League for 6 years, not Bryce's team, which would have looked like favoritism, but a neighboring district's, which looked like generosity. Darlene volunteered at the church food pantry every second Saturday and made sure the church newsletter mentioned it. Bryce, my adoptive brother, 1 year older than me biologically theirs, was the sun around which the Mercer solar system organized itself. He was charming in the way that people who have never been told no tend to be charming, effortlessly, temporarily, and in ways that leave you feeling vaguely diminished without being able to name the mechanism. He had gone to a private high school on a partial scholarship, the remainder of which had been quietly funded by household money I would later trace. He had started 3 businesses, none of which survived their second year, each of which had been seeded with what Gary described as family investments and what I would later describe, in a legal document, as $47,000 in undocumented transfers from accounts that family subsidy money had flowed into. I was the practical one. I was the background character. I was the one who filed the family's taxes for free every April because no one else knew how, the one who called the insurance company when Gary's car was rear-ended, the one who set up Darlene's retirement account and explained compound interest to her in 3 different ways, across 2 separate Sunday dinners until it finally settled somewhere behind her eyes. I was the load-bearing wall. I just didn't know yet that they'd been planning to knock me down. Subscribe right now if you have ever been the capable one in your family, the one everyone called when something needed to be handled, while simultaneously being treated like you were the one who needed the most help. You are not alone. Hit that button and stay with me, because this story is just beginning. The morning after graduation, I woke at 6:47 a.m. in my apartment, my own apartment, which I had rented and furnished entirely on my own income, which no one in my family had ever visited, and I opened my credit monitoring application out of habit. I had set it to flag any new accounts or hard inquiries attached to my social security number. It was a professional reflex, the same way a surgeon washes their hands without thinking about it. There was a flag, a new joint checking account at a regional bank I had never used. My social security number listed as a co-account holder. Current balance, $62,400 in pending deposits. I sat with that number for approximately 45 seconds, then I opened a new spreadsheet. The spreadsheet was a habit I had developed in my first year as a financial planner, when a mentor told me that the difference between panic and strategy was almost always a well-organized column structure. I had never forgotten that. So I opened the spreadsheet, I labeled the columns, source, amount, date, method, notes, and I began. It took me 11 hours. I cross-referenced the account number with a donor receipt email that had been CC'd to a family address I still had access to, a shared inbox Darlene had set up years ago for household correspondence and never thought to remove me from. I found the GoFundMe. I found the title, Help Elaine Begin Her New Chapter After College. I found the profile photo, my own graduation portrait, lifted from a Facebook post I had made 12 hours earlier. I found Darlene's name as the campaign organizer. I found the campaign description, which included phrases like, after years in the foster system before we found her, and we've given everything to make sure she had a chance, and now she needs our community's help to get on her feet. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time. Slowly. The way you reread a document when your brain is refusing to process what your eyes have already confirmed. $38,200 raised through the GoFundMe platform. $14,200 in direct wire transfers from 2 individual donors. Family friends I recognized by name, both retired, both longtime church members. $10,000 in cash and check donations processed through the church's auxiliary fund. $62,400. Total. Every dollar raised in my name. Every dollar deposited into an account I hadn't opened. Every dollar collected on the premise that I was financially vulnerable, systemically disadvantaged, and in need of community rescue. I was sitting in my apartment, at my desk, under the glow of 2 monitors, in a building I paid for with money I had earned managing other people's wealth. I did not cry. I did not call anyone. I picked up my coffee, cold by then, the mug leaving a ring on the coaster I'd bought at a museum gift shop on a work trip to Chicago, and I drank it, and I kept building the spreadsheet. Because there was more. In the same shared inbox, Buried under 2 years of forwarded newsletters and pharmacy receipts and Bryce's various LLC registration notices, I found a series of emails between Gary and an estate attorney in Columbus. The thread had started 7 months ago. The subject line read, Question re, co-trustee rights irrevocable trust. Gary had been asking, carefully, indirectly, with the specific vagueness of someone who suspects they don't have standing but is hoping a lawyer will tell them otherwise, whether an adoptive parent could petition for co-trustee designation on an irrevocable trust established before the adoption. The attorney's responses were polite and increasingly discouraging. Gary's questions grew more specific over time. He had somehow learned the trust existed. I would later determine through a family friend who worked in the probate clerk's office, but had no idea of its structure, its terms, or its current value. He had spent $4,200 in legal consultation fees pursuing an avenue that had no legal basis. He had never told Darlene about it, based on the emails. He was working on this alone, quietly. The way Gary did everything. Not loudly enough to be accountable, not quietly enough to be invisible. I added a new tab to the spreadsheet. I want to stop here and tell you something that took me a long time to understand, something that might reframe not just my story, but yours. Psychologists and adoption researchers have a name for what I grew up inside. They call it instrumental adoption. A dynamic in which a child is adopted not primarily for the child's benefit, but to serve the family's needs. Needs that can be emotional, social, financial, or some layered combination of all three. In my family's case, there were adoption tax credits and federal subsidies totaling $38,750 over 6 years, money that was legally designated for my benefit, my education, my care, that was absorbed into the household general fund, and spent on Bryce's private school tuition. And a kitchen renovation I was not consulted on and did not benefit from. But the financial piece was almost secondary to something deeper. In a narcissistic family system, the family is not a collection of individuals. It is a single organism, and every member of that organism has an assigned role, not based on who they are, but on what function they serve. Darlene needed a story, Gary needed a project, Bryce needed a foil. I was the adopted child, the proof of their goodness, the prop in their public performance, and eventually, the asset they assumed would be accessible when they needed it. There is an architectural metaphor I keep returning to. A load-bearing wall looks exactly like every other wall in the house. It is painted the same color, it holds the same pictures. From the outside it is indistinguishable from the walls that do nothing but divide space, but remove it, or try to, and the ceiling comes down. The load-bearing wall is the one that is never thanked. It is the one that, when the owners decide to renovate, is the first one they point to and say, "Can we take this one out?" I had been holding up the Mercer household for 22 years. I had done it invisibly, competently, and without credit. And on the night of my graduation, while rain came down outside a limestone-walled restaurant in Columbus, Ohio, the people I called my family pointed at me and said, "Can we take this one out?" The answer, as it turned out, was no. By the end of that first week I had a complete forensic picture. I had the GoFundMe records, donor names, amounts, dates, the campaign description with its specific false claims. I had the bank account documentation, my name, my social security number, added without my signed consent, receiving funds raised in my name under false pretenses. I had 6 years of federal and state adoption subsidy records, requested through a formal FOIA submission I had filed as a routine matter years earlier when I was doing my own financial history audit. Those records showed the exact amounts disbursed, the years they were received, and the legal requirement that they be used for the named child's direct benefit. I had Gary's emails to the estate attorney. CC'd forwarded, sitting in the shared inbox like a confession left on the kitchen counter. And I had 4 minutes and 38 seconds of audio recorded on my phone in the corridor of a limestone-walled restaurant, in which my mother's voice described me as financially struggling, systemically disadvantaged, and in need of community rescue, while I stood 20 feet away with a fiduciary license and a $900,000 trust. I had a folder, I had a spreadsheet, I had a timeline. I called my attorney on a Tuesday morning at 8:03 a.m. Her name was Patricia Owens. She was a civil litigation attorney who specialized in financial fraud and estate law. I had worked with her firm twice in my professional capacity, referring clients who needed trust restructuring. She knew my professional background. She did not know my personal history. I told her everything in 52 minutes, without crying once, while she took notes in a yellow legal pad and occasionally said, in the specific register that attorneys use when they're calculating exposure rather than offering sympathy. She called in her colleague, a forensic accountant named David Chen, who had a specialty in charitable solicitation fraud, for the second half of the meeting. David looked at my spreadsheet for approximately 4 minutes before he said, "This is textbook. Charitable solicitation fraud, wire fraud given the online platform, potentially elder financial exploitation on two of the donors given their ages. The question isn't whether you have a case." He looked up. "The question is how much of this you want to be criminal versus civil." I said, "I want it to be both." Patricia nodded. She didn't look surprised. She uncapped her pen and drew a line down the center of her legal pad. On the left side she wrote, "Criminal." On the right side she wrote, "Civil." Then she looked at me across the table and said something I wrote down afterward and have not forgotten. "Elaine, you are the complaining witness, the victim of record and the sole controlling party of the one asset they were actually trying to reach. You have every legal right to all of this. The only real question is, what outcome do you want?" I had been thinking about that question for 8 days. I had a very specific answer. I want to be precise about what happened next, because I think precision matters. Not for drama, for accuracy. Because the thing that people get wrong about moments like this one is that they imagine them as emotional. Hot, driven by anger. This was not hot. This was the temperature of a server room. Controlled, exact, and very, very cold. I had exactly 48 hours to execute 3 specific actions before Darlene's journalist contact published the human interest piece that was, I had confirmed through Patricia, currently in editorial review at a mid-size regional publication. 48 hours before a false narrative about my financial circumstances became a matter of public record. I used every one of them. The first move. The account. At 9:02 a.m. on a Thursday, 17 days after graduation, I walked into a branch of the regional bank where the fraudulent joint account had been opened. I had with me my government-issued identification, a notarized statement from Patricia's office attesting that I had not authorized the account's creation or the use of my Social Security number, and a formal fraud complaint already filed with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau the previous afternoon. The branch manager, a composed, middle-aged woman named Sandra, who dealt with financial fraud in the specific, businesslike way of someone who has seen it many times before, reviewed my documentation for 11 minutes. Then she picked up her phone, called their fraud department, and said words that I wrote down verbatim because I knew I would want them later. "We have a case of unauthorized account creation with a confirmed SSN application. Freeze the account pending investigation. 62,400 frozen pending fraud review." I thanked Sandra. I walked out. I did not call Darlene. The second move, the trust. At 2:15 p.m. the same day, Patricia filed a formal cease and desist letter with the estate attorney Gary had been consulting, the Mercer family address of record, and Gary's personal email, all simultaneously delivered. The letter cited his 7 months of unauthorized inquiry into an irrevocable trust in which he held no legal interest, no standing and no claim. It contained the name of the trust, its legal structure, and a single paragraph explaining that any further effort to pursue co-trustee designation or any communication with court officers regarding the trust would be treated as an act of tortious interference and responded to accordingly. It also, in its final paragraph, disclosed for the first time the current trust valuation, $900,000. I want you to understand what that number meant to Gary Mercer in that moment. For 7 months, he had been paying an attorney $4,200 to explore access to something he imagined might be worth, at most, a few $100,000. A modest windfall, a comfortable supplement. Something he could position as family resources without anyone looking too closely. He had just learned, in a cease and desist letter delivered on a Thursday afternoon, that the number was $900,000, and that the door was not just closed. The door had never been his to open. Patricia told me later that the estate attorney called her office within 2 hours to confirm receipt and to clarify, unprompted, that he had advised Gary throughout that the inquiry had no merit, attorneys protecting their own records. Standard procedure, I noted it anyway. The third move, the journalist. This one required the most precision, because it was the move with the widest aperture, the one that could not be undone once it was made. I had confirmed through Patricia's media law contact that the journalist, her name was Claire, and she had been writing human interest pieces for the regional publication for 6 years, had filed her story based almost entirely on information provided by Darlene. She had made no independent verification of my financial circumstances. She had not contacted me. She had accepted Darlene's framing completely, which is understandable. The story was emotionally compelling, the family was publicly respected, and there was no obvious reason to doubt it. What she did not know was that the story contained multiple specific, documentable false claims that, if published, would expose her and her publication to defamation liability. I called her directly. I introduced myself. I told her who I was in relation to the story she was preparing. I told her, in a single sentence, that I was a licensed fiduciary with a $118,000 annual salary and approximately $900,000 in controlled trust assets, and that I had documentation of all of it going back 4 years. I told her that the charitable fundraiser conducted in my name had been opened without my consent, using my name and photograph, to collect money under false pretenses. She was silent for approximately 6 seconds. Then she said, "Can you send me the documentation?" I sent her 41 pages, bank records, trust summary, tax filings, salary verification, the audio recording. She called back in 3 hours. She was not publishing the original story. She was, however, now investigating an entirely different one. The phone started ringing at 11:17 a.m. on Friday. First, Gary, 3 times in 6 minutes. I did not answer. Then Darlene, twice. Voicemail. I did not listen. Then Bryce, which surprised me. Bryce almost never called, preferring the emotional minimum of a text, and then 2 numbers I recognized as church deacons, likely alerted by Darlene, and then Gary again, and then a number I didn't recognize that was, I would later learn, the estate attorney calling to ensure I'd received the cease and desist confirmation. I sat at my desk and watched the phone screen light up, over and over, like something that had been struck, and didn't know yet that it was falling. I didn't answer a single one. Instead, at 2:30 p.m., I sent a single text to Darlene's number. It contained one sentence. I will be at Calvary Lutheran at 4 p.m. on Sunday. Bring Gary. She responded in 40 seconds. What is this about? I put the phone face down and went back to work. Calvary Lutheran was the church where Darlene had organized the fundraiser, where the envelope donations had been collected, where the auxiliary fund had processed $10,000 in cash and checks raised in my name. It was also the church where Pastor William had known Darlene for 19 years and had, in that time, developed what I suspected was a fairly accurate internal model of who she was, even if he had never said so out loud. I arrived at 3:45 p.m. with Patricia and a printed summary document, 11 pages, clean formatting, every number sourced and cited. The kind of document that looks like what it is, assembled by a financial professional, reviewed by a legal professional, and presented without apology. Pastor William met me in the vestibule. I had called him Saturday morning, introduced myself, and explained, briefly, that there was a financial matter involving his auxiliary fund that I believed he would want to understand before it became a matter of public record. He had listened carefully. He had asked 2 questions. He had said, "Come on Sunday, I'll make sure we have a quiet space." Gary and Darlene arrived at 4:07 p.m. Gary saw Patricia first. He slowed down in the doorway, that specific deceleration of a man who has just recalibrated a situation and doesn't like the new math. Darlene walked in 3 steps ahead of him, which is what Darlene always did. She preferred to enter rooms first so she could establish the emotional temperature before anyone else could set it. She saw me, she smiled, the way she always smiled when she needed to perform composure for an audience. "Elaine," she said, "what is all this?" I said, "Please sit down, Darlene." She sat, Gary sat. Pastor William and one of the deacons, a retired accountant named Robert, whom I had specifically asked to be present given his financial background, sat along the wall. I put the 11-page summary on the table. I said, "I want to walk through this together. I want to make sure we're all looking at the same numbers." Darlene glanced at the document. Then she looked at me. Something moved behind her eyes. Not guilt, exactly, recognition. The specific recognition of someone who has been caught not by accident, but by architecture. By someone who has been building a case longer than you knew. Elaine, if this is about the account is frozen, I said. The bank's fraud division is reviewing it. The CFPB has an open complaint. The IC3 has been notified about the online component. Gary said nothing. He was looking at the table. The GoFundMe has been reported to the platform, I continued. The 41 donors are in the process of being notified and refunded. Claire Hendricks at The Advocate is aware of the full picture and is no longer publishing the original story. Darlene's jaw tightened. You called Claire? Claire called me, I said, which was close enough to true to say without flinching. After she received documentation that the claims in your story were not accurate. You are making this into something it isn't. The account received $62,400, I said. Raised in my name, using my photograph. With claims about my financial circumstances that are not accurate. I have a recording. I placed my phone on the table. I pressed play. We're just so grateful she has somewhere to call home, Darlene's voice said, from a restaurant in May, through a phone speaker in a Lutheran church in June. It hasn't been easy, financially. The room was extremely quiet. Darlene turned to Gary. Tell them, she said. Tell them about the sacrifices we made. Darlene, Gary said, and then he stopped. Because what was there to say? He was sitting across from the cease and desist letter he had received 48 hours ago. The letter that had told him that the thing he had spent 7 months quietly pursuing, the $900,000 thing, was untouchable. He was sitting across from a daughter he had believed was his financial future, and who had turned out to be, in the most precise sense, the opposite. He looked at the pastor. The account was Darlene's idea, he said. I didn't know the details of how she set it up. Darlene's head turned toward him so fast and with such force that it was almost physical, the specific violence of a person being betrayed by their own collaborator in real time, in front of witnesses, in a church. Gary, she said. His name like a door being slammed. I'm not going to, he started. Don't, she said. I'm not going to sit here and, Gary. Pastor William placed both hands flat on the table. He said quietly, I think we all understand the gravity of what's in front of us. The church auxiliary funds are a matter I'll need to address separately with the board. Elaine, I want you to know that this congregation takes its financial integrity seriously. I am sorry that our infrastructure was used in a way that caused you harm. I thanked him. Bryce, who had driven Darlene to the church, was not in the room. He had remained in the parking lot. I would learn later, from a text he sent me 2 weeks afterward, the only communication I have had with him since, that he had sat in the car for the entire meeting and then driven home alone, leaving his parents to find their own way back. Even Bryce in the end knew when the math had changed. The legal and financial consequences arrived not in a single dramatic event, but in the way that structural damage always manifests, gradually and then all at once. Within 2 weeks, the regional bank completed its fraud review and confirmed that the joint account had been opened without my documented consent. The $62,400 remained frozen pending resolution of the fraud complaint. The GoFundMe platform suspended the campaign and initiated donor refunds. 41 people received emails notifying them that the campaign had been found to violate the platform's terms regarding accurate representation of beneficiary circumstances. 41 people who had given money in good faith to help a young woman they believed was struggling. 41 people whose names were in Darlene's church community, her social circle, her carefully constructed public life. 41 refunded donations, each one a small, quiet implosion in the ecosystem she had spent decades building. 2 months later, Patricia filed the civil demand letter, $38,750, representing the full value of the adoption subsidies and tax credits received by the Mercer household over 6 years that were legally required to be used for my direct benefit. The letter outlined the documented misuse, Bryce's private school tuition, the kitchen renovation, and gave Gary and Darlene 60 days to respond. They could not pay it outright. The demand, combined with the legal fees they had accumulated, Gary's estate attorney bills, the family attorney they retained after the church meeting, put enough pressure on their finances that by month 4, they had listed their home on the market, not a foreclosure. A forced sale, which is a different kind of humiliation, the kind you have to perform willingly, listing price and all. The criminal investigation moved on its own timeline, as these things do. The state attorney general's charitable fraud division opened a formal inquiry. I was not its driver. I had simply provided the documentation and let the mechanism operate. As of this recording, the matter remains under review. I will not speculate on its outcome. What I can tell you is what happened to Bryce. Without the family home as a staging ground, without Gary and Darlene's financial infrastructure quietly propping up his next venture, without the invisible subsidy of a household that had always absorbed his failures and kept running, Bryce got a job, a real one. In logistics, which is not glamorous and requires showing up at 7 a.m., which Bryce had previously treated as a theoretical time of day. The last I heard, he was doing adequately. I felt something about this that was not quite warmth, but was in the neighborhood of it. I hope it holds. 6 months after graduation, I signed a lease on a new apartment. Bigger than the last one. 7th floor, northeast corner, with windows that face the city and enough light in the mornings to read without turning on a lamp. I furnished it slowly with intention. Not with urgency or expense, but with the particular deliberateness of someone who has decided that the spaces they occupy should feel like choices. I bought a kitchen table that seats 4. I bought 2 coffee mugs before I needed them, which turned out to be correct. Her name is Maya. She is 16 years old, and she is my biological half-sister. Same mother, different father. And I found her 3 years ago through a DNA registry that neither of us had intended to be a reunion mechanism, and yet, she had been in the foster care system for 8 years. I had been quietly consulting with a family law attorney for 14 months before the machinery of her situation and the machinery of mine aligned in the specific way that legal proceedings occasionally do. On a Tuesday in October, I became her legal guardian. She does her homework at the kitchen table now. She drinks the second cup of coffee with 2 sugars, and I have said nothing about this because I am trying very hard to be the kind of guardian who understands which battles actually matter. She is brilliant in the way that children who have been underestimated for years sometimes are. Specifically, quietly, and without any particular need for you to notice. The trust documents, Ruth's trust, my grandmother's 40-year legacy of modest wisdom and patient investment, are in a folder in the filing cabinet in my home office. I have added a secondary beneficiary designation. I have also begun a conversation with the trust attorney about establishing an educational subtrust, specifically for Maya's college funding, ring-fenced and clean and hers. Ruth never met me. She left me her life's work anyway. I intend to make sure that generosity carries forward. There is a concept in philosophy and restorative justice called corrective justice, the idea that when a wrong has been committed, justice is not achieved by inflicting equivalent harm on the wrongdoer, but by restoring what was taken to the person from whom it was taken. It is a fundamentally different framework than punishment. Punishment says, you must suffer for what you did. Corrective justice says, what was wrongly removed must be returned, and the record must be accurate. What I did was not revenge. I want to be precise about this, because I have thought about it carefully. I did not take anything from Darlene and Gary that was theirs. I reported a fraud. I protected an asset. I corrected a false public narrative. Every consequence they experienced was a direct and proportionate result of choices they made, financial mechanisms they set in motion, documentation they generated and signed. I did not bankrupt my family. I simply declined to continue being the infrastructure that kept them solvent. There is a difference, and the difference matters. The load-bearing wall did not come down. The wall simply stopped allowing people to build on top of it without acknowledgement, without permission, and without paying the load it was carrying. I had been the practical one for 22 years. I had managed other people's finances with precision and care. I had held up a structure that called me daughter while treating me as an asset. And on the night of my graduation, in the corridor of a limestone-walled restaurant, I listened to my mother describe my poverty to a journalist, while the rain came down outside and the crystal wine glasses caught the light. I pressed record. I built the spreadsheet. I made the calls. And then, one October Tuesday, I poured 2 cups of coffee, 2 sugars in one, and sat across from a 16-year-old girl doing homework at my kitchen table, in a city that belongs to me, in a life that is genuinely precisely mine. I had to become the villain in their story, to become the protagonist in my own. I do not regret a single column in that spreadsheet. If you have ever held up a structure that refused to credit you for carrying it, if you have ever been the practical one, the capable one, the one they called when something needed to be handled, while simultaneously being described as the one who needed the most help, share this video. Someone in your life needs to hear it. You are not a burden. You are not what they said you were. You are the load-bearing wall, and you have every right to decide what you will and will not continue to hold. If you want to hear more stories about people who chose themselves when no one else would, make sure you are subscribed. Leave a comment. Tell me where you are in the world tonight, what time it is, and whether the story found you when you needed it to. Because here's what I know, the record is always there to be corrected. The spreadsheet can always be opened. And the people who counted on you not reading the documents carefully, they forgot who they were dealing with. Elaine.